Elena once sat in the condo she bought with drug money in despair over the hole she had dug herself. She had multiple warrants and a son she desperately wanted to be a good mother to, but saw no way of beating her addiction and fixing the mess she had created. So she took more methamphetamine than she ever had before, loaded a gun, and asked God to forgive her for what she was about to do. She's not sure what happened after that, but she's so grateful that sometime after she blacked out, it might have been hours, it might have been days, someone stopped, looked in her apartment window, found her, and directed her to the rescue mission. David found himself in a tough situation. Thanks to a few bad runs on a fishing boat out of the Santa Barbara harbor and his cocaine addiction, he ended up taking up residence in some bushes along the railroad tracks. For 10 years, thousands of people passed by him each day, and he heard the animals in the zoo. And thousands of people passed him by on their trains. Sometimes when he got hungry or he needed a fix, he'd head out to State Street in hopes that enough people would take notice of him so that he could get the money he needed. He wasn't proud of what he did, and the fact that 90% of the people didn't even take notice of him was always painful. But that is where his hopelessness drove him. And I could go on about the different friends I've made since coming to Santa Barbara 15 years ago. But what has struck me so often is the pain of losing the pace of life, because their own circumstances and suffering were troubling enough, and no doubt they may have borne some responsibility for them. But additional hurt came from just watching life and people go on around them. And though I haven't had the particular struggles of Elena or David, I think I know some of what they're talking about, because one of the real frustrations about suffering and pain is the fact that it appears that other people are not going through it. And then true hopelessness and loneliness sets in when one loses sight of any way of getting back on the pace with life. Well, this morning I'd like to take a look at a passage that speaks to that, reading from Mark chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed over by the boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, and yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child's not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished, and he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. The word of the Lord. Now, I was made aware by Steve that you recently spent time in Mark chapter 5, but it is actually probably my favorite chapter in the Bible, the Gospel of Mark being my favorite book, and Mark 5 is just, you talk about ordinary time, but let's look at an ordinary day in the life of Jesus. And one of the other reasons it's my favorite, it's one of my favorite passages is when I was in seminary, I learned a lot of theological terms, and I forgot most of them, but one of the ones I remembered was the sandwich. And if you Google or kind of look up the Markan sandwich, it's a term that theologians came up with to when Mark does this literary device of sandwiching two stories within each other. And these two stories play out, and there's something about the way these two stories intertwine that they're told in sequence together. And so, seeing as I have an affinity for sandwiches in general, it was just the term that stayed with me, but I think at some point the German philosopher or German theologians ran out of big words to use, and they're just like, well, let's call it a sandwich. But there's some point that Mark is making here. And before we get to the two stories, it's helpful to know what some of the larger movements are in the gospel. Because this story is found in the first third of the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus' ministry is gaining a following in and around rural Galilee. And word seems to be spreading, and people are coming to check out this man they've heard so much about. Chapter 5 begins with this very dramatic episode of Jesus delivering a demonized man across the water, something which just causes a great stir in the land across the lake. And as his followers sail back, there had to be some amazing discussion going out and some speculation about what did they just see and who is this man, and the fact that people are taking notice of Jesus. Wherever they go, there are crowds. And there's growing evidence being presented that Jesus is more than just some itinerant prophet or miracle worker or teacher, but someone more important, the Messiah they have been waiting for. And the more important one becomes and the more stature one has, the more demanding life can get. Which brings us to verse 21, our text this morning, where Jesus and his disciples arrive back in Galilee. And he stands to get another boost in prominence because they are approached by Jairus, a leader of a synagogue. And we don't know exactly where this is, but regardless of where they were, the synagogue leader would be one of the most influential and recognized people in the town, village, or city. And this could be a very fortuitous occurrence for those who are wanting to see Jesus gain a higher level of visibility. Jairus is readily recognizable, as are the members of his family. Information about them is passed through chains of communication, and it is well known that Jairus has a very sick daughter whose condition is grave. And I resonate with this because, as many of you know, I had a very sick son. And I was very aware of the community's concern as they followed Rudy in his life. But when we see what's going on in Mark here, that may not be the first thing in everybody's mind when Jairus goes down to meet Jesus at the beach, because there has been conflict between Jesus and the synagogue leaders. And probably what would have been expected is that Jesus would be, Jesus is coming, that Jairus would just be standing his ground on the lake shore saying, "Nope, Jesus, you go somewhere else, not here, not in our town." And the surprise that must have taken place, even if you were not in earshot, to see this important man suddenly fall to his knees in front of Jesus. And you have to think, if you couldn't even hear a word that was being said right away, you knew what he was asking Jesus to do. That he was a desperate dad just wanting somebody to help him with his daughter, putting any kind of theological or territorial disagreement aside. And then, as Jesus decides to go with him, there has to be this incredible building expectation as word travels that Jesus is going up to Jairus' house. And there's a crowd jockeying for position to get to Jesus and probably also trying to beat him up to Jairus' house. Because this could now be something major. This is the big time. While the previous miracles kind of helped marginalize rural people and a crazy demoniac across the water, now they have been sought out with a very important request from somebody extremely significant. And it's as this drama is building that suddenly a very different character appears and kind of stops the momentum of the story. From Mark's few lines about her, we realize we can infer quite a bit about what her life has been like. She had suffered from this bleeding and hemorrhaging for over 12 years. And perhaps that's not something acutely painful, but over such a span of time, even a nagging kind of discomfort would probably become unbearable. And Mark tells us that obviously about it, because she spent kind of the majority of her time and in everything she had in trying to get it treated and deal with different doctors. And who knows how many times she had her hope built up, only to see it dashed when the chronic condition returned. And how many times did she have to speculate with kind of people thinking about maybe this was some kind of judgment from God or brought on by some kind of lifestyle choice she made. And she knew it was getting worse. Her ailment was coming to the point where it defined her completely. It is no longer just a private headache that she has to deal with, but it was her life. And frankly, it's my suspicion that it's not just Mark that doesn't know her name, but the city as a whole does not really know who she is, but she's just some odd invalid they all know living in their midst. And that leaves her to be identified by really one of the most unfortunate names you could get. This is, in the Bible, she is the bleeding lady. And given the hygiene standards of the day, without getting too graphic on a Sunday morning, this kind of bleeding would have been very hard to conceal. And in addition to the humiliation, she probably had to endure unfortunate taunts and teasing, because just because people were in the Bible, don't think they were any less crude and uncivil than they would be today. But she was also impure of temple worship, impure in terms of temple worship. So in addition to all this, she had to deal with the loneliness of being an outcast and being outside kind of the presence of God and where people came to worship God. As long as there was no cure for her condition and it didn't resolve herself, she had no hope of getting back into the flow of community life. And so she stood outside it for over 12 years. And yet on this day, there is something about Jesus that draws her out into this huge crowd. And Mark tells us that somehow, amidst all these people jockeying for position, people that would probably cringe at the thought of even coming in contact with her, she elbows and winds her way up to the front, and then she is standing right behind him, and she makes this desperate grab for his coat. And suddenly, that pain is gone. And it just stops her dead in her tracks as the crowd just keeps moving along. Now, a big part about both these stories is the way both stories resolve. We can't overlook that. I mean, both people who come in contact with Jesus on this day receive healing. The woman is cured. Jairus' daughter is brought back from death. I mean, people that were looking for Jesus to pull something big off will not be disappointed. And there are several things that we can focus on the passage in the way it kind of, the two stories come at us, because you can focus on the healings and the miracles. You can focus on the perspective of the Jairus crowd, which it seems to which the disciples belong, and see the great thing that Jesus did for this important man. But if you do that, you could be in danger of viewing this woman as some kind of a literary obstacle, an inconvenience, or a distraction. We share a genuine sense of concern as we read that they might not get to the dying girl on time. A lot of times when we read these stories in Mark, we realize in the Gospels, it may take us seconds to read them, but it could have been a long walk up to Jairus' house. Could have taken hours. And this drama heightens even more when we get word from Jairus' house that it's actually too late. Now, we could summarize the day kind of in the way it resolves by just saying that, wow, this precious little girl was slipping away. We thought she was dead. Just moments before Jesus got there, we thought it was too late. But even though he stopped and talked to the bleeding lady, everything turned out great. But that again reduces this woman to just some kind of an interlude. And Jesus clearly does not view her as that. And imagine what that must have meant to her. Because regardless of how anyone might refer to this day as the day that Jesus came to town and healed Jairus' daughter, for her it is always going to be the day that he healed her. It will always be the day that the most prominent person ever to come through the town didn't overlook her, but healed her and then stopped in the crowd to look for her. And after 12 years of misery and isolation, he addresses her as daughter. Because Jesus refuses to get caught up in this inertia of the moment. And you can tell as the woman's, he creates this awkwardness after the woman touches him by stopping. And he's like, who touched me? And the disciples are like, what do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's been touching you. We got to hurry. This little girl's dying. But finally, this woman must have stepped out into as she's found out, must have stepped into this very small opening in the crowd. And she owns up to it. But by demanding to see her and then having this exchange with her, Jesus is making it very clear that she is just as prominent a character to him as Jairus, and there's no item on his agenda that will deter him from stopping. And you think about it, if we were kind of coaching Jesus on kind of priorities, we might take things a little bit differently and still come off feeling that the day was a win. We could just say, hey, on the way up to Jairus' house, this lady came in contact with Jesus and she was healed without a break in the story. And I think we could all make the justification that, in light of the fact that the errand they were going on was to save a little girl, a 12-year-old girl at the point of death, that probably any other item on the agenda, I just don't think we can think of a more pressing agenda item. And I think even if we were dealing with the woman, we could think, well, she could endure for one more day while Jesus heals the little girl. Or if we were coaching Jesus, we'd say, okay, Jesus, if you're going to heal her, but maybe can we do the talking on the way back after we heal the little girl? But Jesus has his own set of priorities that just focus on a person in pain and loves them. And as impressive as that healing might have been, I think there's more time involved in seeking out this woman and addressing her as a person, which obviously hadn't been done for some time, and listening to her story. Verse 33 says that she told him the whole truth. And something tells me this was not just an executive summary that she gave. Because you can't sum up 12 years of suffering in an elevator speech. I mean, I've thought about, I've had my son in the hospital, and a basic ER story can take hours to tell. If one of us went to the ER last night and then we'd say, well, the nurse came in and she did this, and then we waited for x-rays and they did labs, and it can almost take longer to tell the story of your night in the ER than the actual time in the ER was. And you think about 12 years of different treatments and doctors and things she had to endure, and just all of that just comes out. And I have to think the disciples must have been losing their minds at this point, just like, are you kidding me? Because not to mention, they're talking about something that these kind of, macho men were probably like, ooh, stop talking about that, Jesus. But I really think even the summary that Mark gives us at the beginning is probably from just listening to what this woman said. 12 years, I went to this doctor, and then I tried this, and then I did that, and she was broke. But Jesus is so focused on her and realizing that the needs go far beyond the physical ones she has. But this need to kind of be welcomed back into community, to be validated and to be loved. And as he's on his way to heal a daughter, he turns around and calls this woman daughter. And as I shared with you earlier, one of the things that I hear in stories of people who have experienced trauma and suffering, who have been in jail for long periods of time, spent time in addiction, is that this sense that while they were in desperation, life kept going on for people around them, and that only added to the agony. Because I think we can see here very clearly that the world generally does not stop for people in pain. And as I mentioned from my own experience, my son was in the hospital for the first 7 years of his life down at UCLA. And one of the most disorienting aspects of this was that while in that ICU room, time had stopped for our family and we were focused on such minute little things and days and hours just watching his condition, life was pretty normal for everyone else. And at no time was this more kind of evident as if there was some crisis and they had to kind of work on Rudy. They would actually, it got bad enough, they'd say, you know what, parents, you need to leave. And we knew when they asked us to leave, we could be out for 5 hours or something like that, just until they got everything back to straight. And it was always the most surreal thing then to think, well, let's go down to Westwood and get something to eat. And you have, college kids upset about the froyo flavors at the yogurt place or whatever. Our world had come to a screeching halt, but obviously it hadn't for anyone else. And there were a few times when we were in the hospital where this wasn't the case, because once when we were there, Michael Jackson was there and Britney Spears was in the hospital. And you'd go out and there would be all these TV trucks out front and you realize, wow. And we'd kind of look around and we saw some of the usual families that were kind of the long-termers in there, and we'd kind of figure out how to kind of navigate our life through this. But you realize, oh, so somebody's in this hospital right now that the world is concerned about. And the world has stopped for their pain, but most pain the world does not stop for. It is only a very rare kind of moment and a rare person where people stop in pain, where the world stops for somebody's pain. And in his context, Jairus is one of those people. But there's clearly one person that it never stopped for, and that's this woman. The world never stopped for her pain until this day. And if I look for a seminal point of application out of Mark 5, I see such a substantial assignment in simply trying to emulate Jesus in stopping. Because there are people hurting all around us. Like this woman who's so often passed by, many of them stand over on the side, just kind of reeling and having fallen off the pace of life and wondering if they'll ever get back on in from the margins. And in light of the fact that the God that we worship stopped, there are a few things that I learned from his example. And the first is, obviously, that agendas and engagement don't automatically exempt me from dealing with people in need. A life and death appointment didn't deter Jesus from stopping for a forgotten woman. Jesus also shows me that it's important to stop to love instead of stopping to question, diagnose, or just provide help from a distance. He does what he can to help the woman, but he doesn't seem to spend a lot of time with questions. He's not worried about how she got there, whether she's truly tried every remedy, whether her sickness might have been brought on by lifestyle choices, or whether society is somehow to blame. And from getting to know a broad number of people in need in our community, I tell you that they are desperate for people to stop and love them, but none are going to gain much from being diagnosed or questioned. And the last thing I see is the way that Jesus affirms human dignity in stopping. He speaks directly to this woman and affirms her value. He is not simply satisfied with healing, with meeting a physical need and moving on, assuming that she is going to be grateful, because she has needs beyond the physical and he is motivated to respond to them. And as I encounter people in our community, even as we kind of just see people in need, it's very clear there's acute need that is so visible. But there's a great deal of human dignity that needs to be affirmed, and that can only come from caring direct contact with another human being. And that's why, as Joyce shared, I'm so proud of the work that we do at the Rescue Mission. And it is very thoughtful work. It's very involved when we're dealing with mental health and physical ailments and frailty and behavioral health and addiction. But at the core of what we do at all our strategies really is just people stopping. The church stopping for people in need. My staff and I get to do that kind of, to be the one stopping, but there are so many people that come alongside us and just say, the church will continue to stop for people in need. We're the only place between Ventura and Santa Maria that is open 365 nights a year to anyone who finds themselves in need of a bed and a meal. And that kind of basic care for somebody is so important that we maintain. And then as we see people kind of get reintegrated, as Joyce shared, we had a graduation last night, and there's a lot that goes into bringing somebody from incarceration and decades of addiction into employment and housing. And it's great we can do that, but to me the most important thing is that they understand and that it all comes from God loving them passionately and deeply, and the people of God do that. And a chance to be with any congregation, and especially this one, is just to thank you for, some of you predate my involvement at the Rescue Mission, and we are so grateful for that. and for what it means in the community. But a few years ago in Los Angeles, now it's over 15 years ago that I lived in Los Angeles, but I remember scrambling to run some errands on a Saturday morning, and we fought our way out of Costco in Azusa. And just as we're coming down the freeway on-ramp and getting on the freeway, a CHP cruiser comes out in front of my car and starts running a traffic brake to slow the traffic down. And 5 lanes of the freeway at a complete stop. And as I sat there in the front row, I have to confess, my immediate thought was, man, was there something I could have done at Costco that would have brought me down this on-ramp like 15 seconds sooner so that I wouldn't be sitting behind this police car right now? And then, as I sat there looking ahead, I saw emergency vehicles on the freeway, but they were on the other side of the freeway from the one I was traveling on. And again, I'm thinking, why do they have to close down the freeway on my side for an accident on the other side? But fortunately, before I went down that line of thinking too long, there was this loud noise as a helicopter just came low over my car and ended up landing on the freeway lanes right in front of me. And suddenly, I just realized that up ahead on that freeway were people whose lives had just gotten instantly desperate, that there were people fighting for their lives. There might be families that have to call funeral homes this afternoon. There could be people that would be in for months, if not the rest of their life, in terms of anguish and change. And my focus was shifted from kind of my self-centered mindset on my own errands to an incredible sense of gratitude that they stopped the traffic for people who need it. In the cars around me, there were people that all had agendas. Some people could have been going to the hospital to have babies and going to weddings, and they were all going to be a little bit late. But no agenda was even counted into the decision that those people made to block the freeway. And I'm extremely glad for that. For the people that are saving lives, they never said kind of like, oh man, that's going to be about 5,000 cars we're going to slow down to get that person out. There wasn't even any consideration given to that. And if it was rush hour, they would have done exactly the same thing to get one person off that freeway to get them to the help they needed. They stopped the traffic for people in pain. And this strikes me as such a clear illustration of what Jesus is modeling to us, that he stops everything for someone in pain. And this is something that we as the church need to take heart as we strive to be like Jesus, because if it's part of God's revealed character to stop for people in pain, then the hallmark of people like us as we try to emulate him should be to stop as well. And along with the comfort that this passage might bring, that he stops for everything for us when we are desperate, it should also be a challenge to us as we extend ourselves to others, because we need to refuse to go on with a momentum and a busyness in the world that ignores pain, or that stops only for certain kinds of pain or certain kinds of people in pain. We need to just recognize deep suffering and simply stop. Jesus, we are grateful for this day, for the example that you set, for your love and for your care and for your compassion and your desire to reach out in pain. And as we are challenged by so many demands in our lives, we're grateful that you stop for us. And I pray for people who might be experiencing pain now, that there would just be this encouragement knowing that you stop for us, and may we stop for others. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I'll never be more loved than I am right now. Wasn't holding you up, so there's nothing I can do to let you down. It doesn't take a trophy to make you proud. I'll never be more loved. never been closer than you are right now. You are Jireh. You are enough. You are Jireh. You are enough. I will be content in every circumstance. You are Jireh. You are enough. Forever enough. More than enough. All than enough. Forever enough. Always enough. More than enough. Don't want to forget how I feel right now. On the mountaintop, I can see so clearly what it's all about. So stay by my side when the sun goes down. Don't want to forget how I feel right now. You are Jireh. You are enough. You are enough. I will be content in every circumstance. Jireh, you are enough. I'm already loved. I'm already chosen. I know who I am. I know you've just spoken. I'm already loved, more than I could imagine, and that is enough. I'm already loved, I'm already chosen. I know who I am, I know what He's spoken. I'm already loved, more than I could imagine, and that is enough. Jireh, you are enough. Jireh, you are enough. I will be content in every circumstance. Jireh, you are enough. Let's stand and sing a verse of goodness of God as our choral benediction. We know that God is with us no matter where we are, in the good times, in the hard times. Let this be our prayer this morning. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire and darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. And I have lived in the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness
Go today with gentleness in your heart and mercy and kindness on your lips. Strive for wholeness through connection, acknowledging the pain and the beauty that you see in others as the same you experience. Be a community that builds bridges, restores sight, binds wounds, forgives trespasses, and loves generously in the same way that God has with you. May the Spirit of God show you the way to empathy that will make us whole again as a people, united by our common need for God and for each other. We pray this in the name of the loving Father, Jesus his Son, and the guiding Spirit. Amen.
Amen.